Go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Margot Isman. I am the policy director with the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project. Thank you all so much for being here for this discussion around the recent Lee decision and the very much ongoing aftermath of that decision and the implication for our work. Before I dive into introducing my esteemed colleagues and our panelists today, I want to just take a minute to introduce YSRP. The Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project, we work to keep children out of adult jails and prisons and to bring home people who were sentenced as children to die in prison. And I think the context for this conversation today is that following the Miller and Montgomery U.S. Supreme Court decisions that determined that life sentences without the possibility of parole were unconstitutional for children and that those decisions should be applied retroactively, YSRP worked with a coalition of other organizations around the state that brought home over 500 people in Pennsylvania, including our two panelists today, who I'm very lucky to call colleagues. With the recent Lee decision, which I'm going to ask Saleem to share a little bit more about the details of that in a minute, we collectively have a similar opportunity to bring folks home at a large scale. This time it's more than 1,100 people. We're looking forward to a discussion today about kind of the mechanics of how to make that happen and also what it's going to take to bring justice to those folks, to do right by them in reentry when it comes time for that, and how we can build community along the way. And so, with that, I think I will turn it over first to John Pace and then to Saleem to do some brief introductions just to introduce yourself. And then we'll have a couple of questions that have a structured conversation. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for audience questions because I already see a really wonderful community of folks in the chat. So, John, can you go ahead and
Yeah.
introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. So thank you, Margot, and thank everyone who is attending this webinar. My name is John Pace. I work with the Youth Sentence and Reentry Project as the Associate Director of Reentry and Engagement. I've been working here with this organization almost since I've returned home, supporting individuals who were once sentenced to die in prison in that transition. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunity to be able to be a part of this process as well.
Hey, good afternoon. Robert Saleem Holbrook. I'm the Executive Director of the Abolitionist Law Center and also our sister organization, Straight Ahead, our C4 arm. I've been in this position. I've been at ALC since I came home in 2018. I was very instrumental in ALC being developed as a movement-based law project while I was incarcerated. And just very excited that, we were able to, crack open death by incarceration in Pennsylvania, and also mindful that although we may have been the head on the hammer, the handle was the movement that has been fighting to end death by incarceration, felony murder in Pennsylvania for decades, long before I came along.
Thank you both. Saleem, maybe just for background, could you start by sharing with folks a little bit about the background of the Lee case and what it means? And maybe also, just because I think folks on this call will be interested, how ALC developed it over time.
Yeah. This is, when we look at this case, this is definitely a case that was brought to us by the movement. And it was that saying of opportunity meets preparation. I will say that we've really been looking to end death by incarceration since our founding. But also the Miller v. Alabama case really, I think, opened up a breach in death by incarceration and life without parole, not just in Pennsylvania, but throughout the country. And very early on, we were looking at how to apply the ruling in Miller to cases beyond juveniles, to cases beyond children. And when I first came home in 2018, one of the first cases that we tried to crack was Avis Lee's case around Avis Lee was convicted of felony murder, kind of similar circumstances. And Brett Brody, our legal director, argued that case, I believe, in front of the Superior Court panel. We lost that case. We always feel as though we didn't lose that case on the merits. We lost that case on procedural grounds. And so we were looking for a way to bring up, attack felony murder in Pennsylvania because it allowed for no discretion. It did not allow the courts to take into consideration culpability. And we just knew that this was instinctively not just wrong, but it was antiquated, you know? And so we started looking at the state constitution as a way to start attacking sentences, not just criminal sentences, but we also, ironically, were looking at it to try and extend voting rights to incarcerated people. We discovered that Pennsylvania's state constitution is what you would call an expansive constitution, and that is it provides much more, from our analysis, protections than the U.S. Constitution. And so Brett was looking at this, and he discovered that Pennsylvania's state constitution does not have a cruel and unusual punishment clause under the Eighth Amendment. It just has a cruel clause. And he was like, I think that we could attack death by incarceration through this clause. But what we knew was we needed a case on direct appeal because Avis's case was on post-conviction, and it's always harder to overturn a post-conviction case as opposed to a case on direct appeal. And Brett was visiting a prison. Derek Lee was in that prison, heard him speaking about ending death by incarceration, speaking about the same issues, how second-degree murder it should be unconstitutional, it's a human rights violation. Just so happened Derek's case was on direct appeal. He was from Pittsburgh. Brett knew the attorneys, knew his case, and took on the case and decided to initiate this very innovative challenge to felony murder under the state's constitution, because, as we all know, the federal courts are stacked with, I guess this is a C3 space, so I got to be very diplomatic, but judges who interpret the Constitution as something that takes as opposed to expand your rights. So we just realized that we're not going to have any luck arguing these cases in the federal courts. So we need to argue them in the state courts. So that's the background on this case. And I mean, we could do a whole seminar just on like how this case was developed, how we met Derek, how someone from the movement, you know, his family member came to Cadby West, one of our movement organizations in Pittsburgh, joined it, started attending the meetings and brought the case to us. But that's how we worked this case up. And then in terms of what the case decided, I mean, the case decided that sentencing someone to life without parole, without looking at their individual the characteristics of the case, without taking in their individual culpability, was a violation of the state Constitution cruel punishment clause. Unfortunately, where we're at now is the implementation of that decision. In America, rights won must be held. They must be kept. They must be implemented. So I feel like we're in this stage now where we now have to fight for this decision in the state legislature, which to me, it should be very clear that the highest court in Pennsylvania ruled that over 1,000 people are serving unconstitutional sentences. To me, I feel like the state legislature should be compelled to act on this injustice. Instead, we are seeing, though, that we are having to push and fight for this to get legislation passed, specifically House Bill 443 by Tim Briggs, which would open up a pathway to release for people who are currently serving these sentences. Our objective was and is to abolish life without parole prospectively in Pennsylvania so that it's no longer a sentence on the table for felony murder. and they'll also offer pathways to release for people who are currently serving life without parole for felony murder. However, unfortunately, we're in the legislature now. We're having a lobbying day next week to bring family members and advocates to Harrisburg to encourage legislators to pass these bills. And we're also continuing to push, media, communities, community members, and advocates to put pressure on the state legislature to pass this bill, because as of right now, that is the avenue of release. Although we're very concerned that the legislators are going to let the clock run out, not make a decision on this, and try and pass the buck back to the courts. And we believe that that is going to put us in not, I wouldn't say unprecedented territory in Pennsylvania, but territory, at least in my lifetime, I have not seen, and that is where a state legislature is refusing to act or implement a Pennsylvania State Supreme Court decision, and the prospects of the legislator acting every day diminishes because they have no incentive to act, which is the really unfortunate part about it.
I think there's a lot more that Saleem could say, and I hope he will. I'll just mention specifically that the court gave the legislature 120 days, and as of today, I believe there are 59 of those left. So it's very much still in process. John, turning to you, how did you first hear about the Lee decision, and what was your personal interest in it?
Yeah. So I don't know exactly how I did hear about it. It might have been through Eleanor. Eleanor was an advisor with us at YSRP, senior advisor. So it might have been through Eleanor, I think, just telling me, oh, do you know this? And I was familiar with the Avis Lee case. And so, I knew the efforts taking place, there. But I think I want to go just like a historical background a little bit. Obviously me and Saleem, did a great deal of time in prison. And before this issue of juvenile lifers, individuals sentenced to life without parole as children, came along, we had no ability to be released, only through commutation, dying in prison, or getting your conviction overturned. One of the low-hanging fruits that was always talked about was the issue of second-degree murder. And that created a great deal of tension within the prisons as well, because we were trying to fight for parole eligibility for lifers in general, because you got individuals who you love and care about that got first degree, and you never really wanted to separate yourself. But the low-hanging fruit was the second-degree issue. And this issue goes way back in the late 80s, when we used to have individuals like Ann Swartzman, Julia Hall. They were fighting for legislation, and Andrew Carn was one of the legislators that was champion for this. But we could never get past that hurdle. But that was always an issue, because I think we knew that there was something wrong about this second degree issue, being convicted of felony murder, knowing that it might not involve intent to commit murder. But yet still you were sentenced to the same sentence of someone convicted of a first degree, not distinguishing yourself, but you knew that there was something wrong with that. And then when you understood the history of that a little bit, going back to 1974, prior to that, when second degree did not involve life without the possibility of parole. And the only reason that it actually became life without the possibility of parole, because during that particular time, you had a lot of homicides that were involved gang wars in the city of Philadelphia. And so they decided we wanted to increase punishment. And so that was one of the impetus that created this mandatory sentence of second degree. But it didn't change the fact that these were unintentional homicides. And so we were always fighting to try to get that second degree with some parole eligibility. So I give ALC a great deal of credit, because I will say this: many of us inside of the prison always, and I think this is Saleem's point, being a little politically correct, always thought that, we didn't think that attorneys fought hard enough to be, I think, creative about how they argued issues. They seemed to go with the traditional argument. If there wasn't a president case that supported it, That's it. We weren't going there. And so I think inside of prison, a lot of people felt that way and had a great deal of apathy about, the advocacy that took place outside. And so to have ALC taking on these issues once I came home and to know that they took on this issue, I think to me it was like refreshing to see someone willing to look at alternatives, look at ways, different ways to challenge some of the injustice that we thought that was actually taking place. And so I think more than anything, I think my excitement came with that. I don't remember exactly when I learned that they did take it on, but I was familiar with the Avis Lee. I thought that was a creative argument. But then knowing that the court had actually accepted the opportunity to hear this case was something else to me too. And just I think just acknowledging that they were still pushing to look, I think, at alternative ways to argue injustices that we thought that were taking place for decades.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing to that, Margot? What's really funny is that prior to this case, we were 0 for 10 in taking on death by incarceration cases, and that means we lost 10 cases in a row. But all you got to do is hit one out the park. And that's what happened with this case. And a lot of times it's just right time, right circumstances. And also, yeah, you're right. We are definitely going to figure out ways of throwing things up on the wall. Now, we're not just going to throw anything up on the wall. We're going to come at it from a very strategic standpoint. And I do think that, we have the fortune of having Brett over here, whose mind is just constantly looking for ways of using the law. And then me and him have a really great relationship going back to 2006, before there was an ALC, using law as a litigation tool, using law as a weapon to free our people and to dismantle carceral systems. So yeah, we are unconventional. We like to consider ourselves insurgents when it comes to the law. And it was just the right time, right place, and right argument. But I also hope that this space is taken up by more people who look at the law from the lenses of an insurgent.
I appreciate that. And I definitely echo John's feeling of just gratitude that we're like in this coalition with y'all to be able to participate in some of these novel strategies. The next question I want to ask is actually kind of a personal one. So, both of you are directly impacted leaders who, when the Miller and Montgomery decisions came down and all of the efforts that came through by so many people, many of whom are on this webinar right now and many of whom are not, um, y'all were still incarcerated. So, what is it like to be leading the movement this time around? What's it like from the other side?
I mean, it feels good. It feels good not to be sitting in the cell, stressing out over a resentencing hearing. I mean, listen, it took us a long road to get here. I'm always mindful that we were a part of a movement, and even with the Montgomery decision, the Miller decision, we were still a part of this movement, however, from different positions, different vantage points. Where we're at now is that our voices are a lot more at the table, our perspectives too, because just having me come in and speak is one thing, but having decision making, having a decision making power is different. And so a lot of us who were recipients of the Miller v. Alabama, the Batts decision, are now in a position to make decisions. And like we're seeing that now around a lot of negotiations around HB 443, right? A lot of those decisions are being determined by people formerly incarcerated who are serving death by incarceration. A lot of the legal challenges or next steps in the lead decision are going to be determined by people like John and I and other people who we are going to give voice to. I think too that what's different too this time around is that we don't want to make the same mistakes that we made last time. There were mistakes. I'm grateful for being home, but I also recognize that it was very top heavy with lawyers last time. I also recognize too that I could remember when the Bats decision came down, that I was not happy at the Bats decision. I was glad that there was going to be some people who were going to be freed by it, but I was not happy that the mandatory minimum that I would be facing would be 35 years, and anyone thought that I would celebrate that would be out of their damn mind. And I remember writing a statement from prison, basically saying that. And I'm in a position now when it comes to the lead decision, when it comes to the negotiations that are going down, that I'm not going to settle for something that is going to have people in prison for 35 or 40 years, and then if it passes, celebrate it. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say no, because that's not for me to say, but I'm not going to walk back and jump up in the air and pat ourselves on the back, because I believe that that's too long for someone to be serving in prison. And in the past, yeah, I've been in the situation with streets bills, the 25, 35. I think that 35 years is even for first degree murder is too long. But I also understood that there were people in prison who would be impacted by that decision, so we supported it. But I'm going to be very clear that I don't believe that people should be serving 35, 30-year prison sentences. I believe that the data, the studies show that people age out, people rehabilitate, redeem themselves, and those are things that we should be in the rooms fighting for. But also, too, at the end of the day, as a movement, we have to build our power up. At the end of the day, this is all about numbers and power. I don't care how brilliant an attorney you are. At the end of the day, it's about numbers and power. Can you get the majority in the legislature? Do you have the power to move them to lower numbers? And at this time, as a movement, we don't. And I think that we should continue to build our power up until we get there. So it feels great to be in this position. I'm always thankful to YSRP. I'm home because of YSRP. They all were my mitigation specialists. There's many others in the space as well. And it feels good to be on this side of the wall fighting. And also, I'll be very clear, when I went into the prisons, I told the men there that we're coming for first degree murder, so I want it done because I have first degree murder. So when I went in and I'm speaking to all these people with second degree, I'm mindful that I remember having first degree, and I remember Greenleaf's first bill for juvenile lifers was only a bill for juvenile lifers who were convicted of second degree murder. And I remember still supporting that bill and telling my sister, who was the campaign coordinator for Pennsylvania, yes, support that bill, even though it doesn't apply to me, because it's going to open the door. When I go in now, I still want to make clear to the men and women, to people in prison who got first degree, the vast majority of cases, close to 4,000, that don't think that we're going to pat ourselves on the back and, we won. No, we're going to come for first degree murder. And we're also mindful that that's going to take years, but we ain't going nowhere. And we just got to continue to build our power as a movement. We got a bunch of interns here who were corrupting lawful terms, and we're talking to them about abolitionist lawyering. We're talking to them to approach the law not as something sacred that we could this is not sacred to me. It's a tool that we need to use to defend our rights, to expand our rights, and to dismantle carceral systems. And they're going to be the next generation that are going to be taking up these battles. So it feels great to be leading it. It feels great to be training future generations of legal advocates to take it on.
Yeah, I echo everything that Saleem has shared. And I think just our experience of being incarcerated, as long as we've been incarcerated, what we had to go through while incarceration, I think it really puts us in a good position, I think, to be able to support the men and women who aren't currently incarcerated, because I think it provides us with a perspective of what justice should look like. I think one of the things I'm grateful for, just really being in a position to be able to support those who are still currently. And so I will give that credit, as Saleem has shared about Brett, in the relationship that he developed while incarcerated, and then being able to be in a position. I think similar, my relationship with YSRP, my relationship with Joanna and Lauren, I think started while incarcerated and continued when I came home. And just the fact that they believed in me enough, and they truly believed that they weren't the solution to the problem. They thought that I was that solution. I was part of that, or I could be a part of that solution because of my experience. And so they were able to like put me in a position to say, okay, this is how you could support those who are coming home, and to think about, like opportunities that are coming along now, because they were able to put me in that position and believe that I could actually, support and do the work that I do. So I'm thankful for that, and I'm clearly thankful that I'm here, out here, and not in there. But I think me still staying. This is why I think also why I think individuals who may not actually do it or practice it in terms of putting those individuals who have that lived experience, and having them next to them and being thought partners with them. I think this is why that's important, because I think that proximity really allows you to think, I think, different about what justice looks like when you're trying to, put it in practical application. I think it was Saleem's relationship with Brett that allowed Brett to be thinking about that, even though I've heard Saleem's story before, and he said Brett was a little, out there already. You know what I mean? But I think just his relationship with you helped inform him even more. And so I think it's important. I think the organizations do connect themselves with those who have this level of experience, because I think it allows them to think about what justice should look like, and how they, a way in which they could practice, pursuing that there. And so I'm thankful just being able to be in a space that I can contribute to supporting those who are coming home.
Thank you both so much for that. And it truly, I mean, I think I'm sure I speak for others on this call, and I say it's really just such a privilege to be in a position to be led by both of you, your brilliance and strategy, and yeah, just deep, deep drive to get this right is genuinely a gift to this movement. And I'm glad to be in it with you. I wonder if you could maybe, Saleem, I know you've recently been into some prisons, and both of you had the experience of this sort of interim period of a new right having been granted by a court and then having to wait for what might happen next. What can you share about what folks on the inside might be going through right now, just to give the folks on this call a little bit of a window into what it's like to wait for it? There's literally a waiting period that the court imposed. What are some of the conversations that are going on the inside right now? And yeah, give us a window into that.
Well, as those of us who did time know, they ain't waiting in there. I'll be honest with you. They already got PCRAs in. They're already talking about attacking the net statute. They're talking about the whole sentencing code. Trust me, it's some wild conversations, man. It's funny because when I went up to Cole Township, I had to tell one brother, because he was talking to me about that unique period in the 70s when they abolished the death sentence but brought it back. There's this category of prisoners who are like in this gray area. They have life without parole, but it's like under I don't know the exact number of them, but when the Pennsylvania abolished the death sentence, these folks were sentenced to life without parole, and so they're technically not second degree murder, but they are. And so we're like categorizing all of them. But I remember he was telling me about the statute and how like all the statutes are invalid, and I was like, yo, bro, listen, you don't got to convince me. I'm not the one. I agree. It's just that that's not the battle that we're going to be taking right now. We got to focus on this battle right now and implement this decision. So I say that to say that they are already moving. They are already putting PCRAs in. I think if anything, I had to look at myself, and I look at myself as a facilitator, because when I went in, yeah, I had some ideals and I shared out for them, but I also wanted to know, okay, what are y'all thinking? Because we don't have all the answers. What are you doing? So there's also a lot of anxiety. I mean, Derek Lee, when the decision came down, he called and said that there was a prisoner in his unit that has been in prison for 50 years on felony murder, and he couldn't believe it. And that, he was like, does this mean I'm going home? Like, am I going home for real, home? And he was like, yeah, this decision could bring you home. So there's a lot of anxiety. There's over, 1,000 people who woke up the day of the lead decision who now have the opportunity to go home and meet their loved ones. So, my advice to them when I went in there with some personal experience was to make sure you start getting in all the programs that are available right now. Make sure that you start getting your support network set up. I will say that I'm really disappointed in the Department of Corrections. I'm really disappointed in the Secretary Harry, because they should be facilitating more legal seminars. They should be facilitating more access into the prisons, so that we could talk to prisoners, and we have been trying to do that. But this is the point too, to what you said earlier, Margot, is the difference is now they have to deal with Saleem Holbrook, who is saying, yo, we want to come in to have these seminars around second degree murder. And I think that they still see me as the rebellious prisoner. They still see me as a problem. And I am a problem. I am your problem. As long as this prison, I'm going to be a problem. Now I'm doing it a different way than I did it than when I was on the inside. But it's inexcusable that we cannot have access to prisons. It's inexcusable that we can't have people serving second degree murder on group calls the way Juvenile Lifers were on those group calls. And so those are some things that we're thinking about, addressing, because again, the DOC should be facilitating this. They have a pilot program that was successful. It was the juvenile lifer process. And you would think that they would just kickstart that right back up, have those information seminars in all the prisons, start getting those people ready for release by putting them in programs. But they're still asking this question: is it retroactive? Is it retroactive? And it's like, well, actually, look, that's going to be determined, but you should be proactive. You shouldn't be sitting here waiting, right, and ask like, well, we don't know whether this is retroactive, so should we do anything or not? That's nonsense. You should be proactive. You should be doing something, because irregardless, this issue is not over, and you have over 1,000 people who have the opportunity to go home. You would think that you would want to start sooner the process to get them ready to go home, as opposed to having us wait for us to have to go back to court to, hopefully we don't have to do that. But if we do have to do it, we would want the Department of Correction to have been proactive on this. So this is an area I think we're going to need some of our partners to help us.
I'm not going to be long. I think I agree with Saleem that I think there is a great deal of anxiety, but there's a great deal of hope too, because I think you were told that you would never come home, and I think there was some hope possibly generated when many of us who were sentenced as children had the opportunity to come home, but that dissipated. Well, actually, there was hope with that, along with the commutations being granted, at that time. Now all those things seem to have settled down, and so this created, I think, generated more hope now once this has occurred, and so now there's that uncertainty as to, okay, how this is going to play out though. But I think they still exist with that hope when it didn't exist. And so I think a lot of them are going through that process. I was fortunate, I think, in terms of how I seen it at the particular time, because I worked in the paraprofessional law clinic down Greater Fort. And so I had a sense of I studied the law. And so I knew how to read it and understand it, knowing, what to anticipate. And so actually a lot of people used to always run to me. That was a pain, when me sitting there having to try to explain to people, what's going on. But it allowed me to have a great deal of patience to wait for the outcome. And so, but just imagine individuals that don't have that level of understanding. They do exactly what Saleem said. They're going to put that petition in because they're afraid that, am I going to miss the deadline? So they want to make sure that they are putting a petition in and preserving rights. So you're going to have a lot of individuals that are going through that process. One of the things I would suggest to them, because I do believe that this is ultimately going to be successful. I think it's pretty clear in terms of what the courts, have ruled. I would encourage them to start focusing on the reentry aspect, to start focusing on like what it's going to look like transitioning back to the community. Because I think, again, many of them, didn't know whether they would actually have the opportunity to come home. And so they don't know how the world currently is out here. And so what can you do to start preparing yourself for that potential opportunity that you will get? And that's where we used to have what we call the Juvenile Lifers Committee under the Lifers organization. And that's one of the things we used to start focusing on, let's preparing ourselves for that potential opportunity. And so that's where I think we could perhaps do more work in terms of one of the things I'm looking at the role we can play as an organization, but building that coalition to think about ways that we can get in there and help support them in this process. I do agree with Saleem wholeheartedly. I think one of the challenges is them looking at us and saying, oh, they were here, and I probably didn't go through the same exact thing Saleem went through because of the prisons that he was particularly in, but still, they still look at me at the same as someone who was formerly incarcerated, and so they haven't thought of me in a different way. And so that's why I think having the partners, and that's one of the things I enjoy, that YSRP tried to really change that narrative about, yes, I'm a part of the legal team. And so we had to fight for that opportunity for me to be able to go into the prisons because we wanted them to see me in a different way. And so I recognize I'm going to still run into those particular roadblocks, but at the same time, I think that's something that we just, I think having those partnerships, I think will help facilitate the opportunity for us to get in there. Because I think that's more important than anything, us getting in there and helping preparing them for that transition. And one of the things I will say too is that, because individuals didn't know that they would have the opportunity to come home, I think you're going to find individuals in all kinds of positions with regard to things that they have been involved in. Some individuals thought, I'm doing life. Why should I be involved in anything? And some individuals were upstate. We called the boondocks back in the day. They're way up there, up in the mountains, and there's not a lot of programs up there. And so, they don't have extensive record of involvement in programs. And so all those are going to be particular challenges for individuals. And so these are the things I would say focus on, because I think the court decision and the outcome is ultimately going to play itself out. But you have to prepare yourself for when that opportunity does come. And are you ready for that opportunity?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, John. And I think I'll share from my perspective, from the policy perspective at YSRP, we clearly see that there are two different ways that this could go. The legislature could get off their hands and decide to do something, in which case we would have mass parole eligibility for this folks, or they might not, right? And perhaps that's the more likely outcome, just given the track record of the legislature doing things with any sense of urgency in Pennsylvania. And in that case, I think we're looking at much more of a resentencing scenario. It's going to look a little bit more like what happened with the juvenile lifers. And I think in either case, it's going to require a great deal of coalition building, of community participation. And I think to the degree that can be led by folks who have been through it before. So, as Saleem said, we can avoid the mistakes that we made the last time. I think we're all better for that. I want to give the last question actually to, we have in the Q&A feature, somebody put in a question from the SCI Phoenix Lifers Inc. men. And they had a question, which is, could you speak to what is wrong with Pennsylvania? Meaning, why is Pennsylvania such an outlier with respect to LWOP, life without parole? And, I think that's a good question. I think there are some political answers to that. I think there are some historical answers to that, but I'd be curious, Saleem and John, from the seats that you're in, how would you respond to that question?
Wow. There's a late prisoner named John Yant, wrote a very good article about the history of life without parole in Pennsylvania. Hopefully, folks can Google that. It's on the Prison Policy Initiative website, Prison Policy Institution website, that I think he would be you would get a lot more out of reading that article than I could give you on this history of life without parole in Pennsylvania. I think it's one, the nature of our state. Look, John alluded to it. Felony murder is actually something that's recent in Pennsylvania. And when I say recent, I would say the last 50 years. And it came about in that wave in the 70s where there was a pushback to the civil rights movement, and we've seen many states adopt more harsher sentencing laws, and felony murder was one of those laws that came out that so-called related to gang war or not having an appropriate punishment. However, if anything, it shows that that punishment disproportionately impacts Black people, disproportionately impacts Latinos. It disproportionately impacts the poor. I think like our statistics show like close to 80% of people serving life without parole for felony murder are Black in Pennsylvania. So there's no question that our sentencing scheme in Pennsylvania is rooted in racial discrimination, poverty, and disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. Another thing is, commutation was a vehicle for people serving life without parole. And, we don't talk about that much, but in the 1970s, the lifers population was 700 people. And throughout the 70s, up until they closed it up in the late 70s, early 80s, you had close to 30 people going home a year out of a population of 700 lifers who were going home receiving commutation. So there was a release valve for it, but with the rise of the tough on crime, the drug war in the 80s, all of this closed up. And so we don't have a release valve. And that's why it's so bad in Pennsylvania. And a lot of our work now is to create that release valve so we could start releasing people, bringing people home. And again, I say just look to the 70s when it was not uncommon for lifers to be going home. The recidivism rate is one of the lowest. The same thing with juvenile lifers. Our recidivism rate is the lowest. So yeah, Pennsylvania is a terrible outliner, but it's not alone. I mean, Mississippi is there, Louisiana, Michigan is still having problems. Even there's some states that Maryland, juvenile lifers in Maryland still aren't coming home, which is crazy. So we have a long ways to go. This is not just a state problem; it's a national problem. However, what I will say is though that there's been tremendous progress, and although there's been a lot of setbacks recently, when you really look at the progress we've made in Pennsylvania, there was a time when Pennsylvania's prison population was close to 54,000 people. We had 33 prisons. Today, the population is somewhere around 34, 36,000. I think we have like 20 prisons. We've brought home close to 300 people serving life without parole as juvenile offenders. People are on average being paroled, although there's still problems. I'm not saying parole is perfect. The parole, there was a time when there was a 70% denial of parole, that those numbers are no longer there. So we made tremendous progress in PA, and we have to keep our foot on the gas and keep fighting. So I do have to always remind myself that despite how bad Pennsylvania is, I mean, if you look at solitary confinement, through our litigation, through the using the American with Disabilities Act, how we've rolled back the use of solitary confinement. Yes, solitary confinement still goes on, but for those of us that did solitary time in the 90s, and there's some people that did it in the 70s and 80s, it's a completely different system in Pennsylvania, and that's a result of a lot of the work not just attorneys, but also movements and prisoners on the inside have made. So we made some accomplishments. We made some strides. We got a long ways to go, but we always have to lift up the wins. And we've won a lot in Pennsylvania, despite this being one of the worst states in the country, with one of the largest legislatures that don't do shit. So we've made some strides.
Yeah, I'm just going to add, I think James Carville political strategy, Democratic political strategist said, when you look at Pennsylvania, he said Pennsylvania is like, you got Philadelphia and you got Allegheny County. He said, and in the middle, you got Alabama. And so in that middle, you have a lot of conservative people that says the social problems that exist, the economic problems that exist in these marginalized communities are their problems. And so they didn't really care about the laws that they created to increase punishment because it didn't affect their communities the same way. And so I think that, to me, I believe that is a part of, I think, the point that Saleem was talking about, the racial dynamics that exist. We create these unfair circumstances for these marginalized communities, and the outcome of them we don't really care about. So, but we're going to give a punishment that we think that doesn't acknowledge that, but just simply saying this is how we're going to respond to these inequities that exist. And so I believe that is part of it. And an unfortunate part about it is that when they create laws, they unfortunately do not want to undo those laws. They often have laws that they create and they never come off the books. They stay on these books for a long time. And we've seen that, there's a reluctance to do that. I was talking, I think, saying earlier, I don't know if I was saying it to Saleem or, Margot and y'all when we was talking, like, I was saying that at one particular time, the idea where second or murder, life without parole was always, interpreted by the courts as meaning life without the possibility of parole. The individual that Saleem cited, John Yacht, he challenged that. Castle, they challenged these statutes, and the court said no, life without parole means life without parole. All of a sudden, the U.S. Supreme Court comes down and with the decision deal with Montgomery versus Louisiana, and they find a way to say, oh, life means life with now. They were able to reinterpret it because they had to respond to it, and so, and it was the courts that responded to it. It wasn't the legislators. The legislators too often, as Saleem said, they don't want to respond to this kind of, particularly when they think that they are dealing with what they call Philadelphia problems or Allegheny problems. So I think that is a part of that reason why.
So it is 12:50. So I want to pivot now to taking some questions. And if folks do have questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A feature. We got a couple of questions so far, so I'll pass these out to our panelists and you guys can choose how you want to answer them. The first one came from John Knoll. It says, does the elimination of this statute outweigh an unconstitutional law? From Freddie Knoll.
You want to respond to that, Saleem?
Does an elimination of the statute?
Yeah. Does the elimination of the statute outweighs an unconstitutional law? Basically, it's unconstitutional.
I mean, it would be great if we got rid of the elimination of the felony murder statute. One of the ironic things that have come up is that we didn't get rid of felony murder in Pennsylvania. The concept of felony murder still exists in Pennsylvania, which is unfortunate. We got rid of the punishment, a mandatory punishment for it. And in a lot of conversations, people are like, yeah, you got rid of felony murder. It's like, no, we didn't. The concept is still there. So I think I understand Freddie's question, but what I will say is that we didn't eliminate the felony murder statute. We eliminated the punishment for being found guilty of felony murder. And then where we're at now is coming up with a new punishment. Wish we could call it accountability, but we know this is Pennsylvania, it's America, so it's going to be a punishment. So that's all I can say with that. In terms of an unconstitutional law, I mean, what was found unconstitutional was the sentence, not the statute. So if we had eliminated the statute, that would be different. Again, the legislature would probably have to come up with a resentencing scheme, or the courts could conceivably interpret it, but we did not eliminate the statute. I wish we could. I would hope that one day we could eliminate felony murder on the front end. That concept that if someone died in the commission of the underlying felony, everyone is equally guilty of that. That's something, regardless to intent. I think that's something that we need to get rid of. The country that started it, England, Britain, got rid of it under their common law doctrine, and we're still holding on to this. So hopefully, it's something that we could one day eliminate.
I was getting ready to say that, despite, where it was adopted from, that no longer practice it. But yet we still do. And that goes to the point that I was saying, that we tend to adopt these laws and make these laws, but we don't want to get rid of them. And that's a prime example. The court in their analysis talked about that history, but yet and still they didn't eliminate it. They went around just talking about assessing culpability, but they could have eliminated it, but they chose not to. They simply said this was unconstitutional. But they gave that history that this is not a common practice anymore.
And I think that the very interesting thing to me is that because there was only one possible sentence for conviction of felony murder on the books in Pennsylvania, when they ruled that one unconstitutional, they left essentially a gap, right? So there is currently today no constitutionally permissible sentence for this crime that is still on the books. So what is the legislature going to do about that? It's an open question. The next question sounds like a little bit of a personal one. How does it feel when you go back inside to visit a prison?
Yeah, I get that oftentimes. So I go in pretty often, to visit some of our client partners, and I tell people, like, really, like, I know I'm coming back out. That's so it doesn't bother me or impact me the same way as I've heard others and how it impacted. I think more than anything, I enjoy going in, I think, to create hope for those who are currently incarcerated. Because I think when they see me come in and they see some of the things I'm doing, I think gives them hope and the possibility of the things that they could potentially be doing. And so if I can do that, it doesn't bother me to go in to create that level of hope for others.
Yeah, for me it's a mixed bag, because I've been home 8 years. I refused to go into prison. I just fought too hard to get the hell out of them. Um, I have a visceral dislike of just everything about them. However, I've lost some close comrades that I did a lot of time with on the inside, and one of my regrets is that I didn't go in and see them. And so that did change my perspective. And then I went in to see Mumia, who's one of our clients, and that was the first time that I went in. And so it opened me up to saying, okay, you should go in to see. And so, like John, I recognize that it does bring hope to the people on the inside. But also for me, it's I feel like as long as I'm also still on this ridiculous lifetime parole, so I'm always mindful that I'm free, but I'm not free. And so that's something that's also in the back of my head as well. So I generally don't like going into the prisons, but I see the utility of going into the prisons, and I do it.
We have time for just one more question. I'll try to answer a couple more in the chat, but this question is about reentry. Is there a need for housing for returning citizens? And if so, what barriers are there? Additionally, what are some community resources available for returning citizens? So, John, I wonder if, just from a reentry perspective, you could close us out by talking a little bit about some of the reentry opportunities and challenges that you see coming out of this decision.
Yeah. There's always a need for housing. You face, I think landlords that discriminate against people who have, convictions. So in general, individuals not having, a place to go. And so there's always a need. I think one of the things that we want to do, I think, and I'm utilizing, my experience coming home and the way in which I think YSRP and other organizations galvanize resources. That's one of the things we will be assessing, like what potential resources exist that will I think eliminate that or alleviate some of the burden when individuals come home, particularly individual. What we saw was when many of us came home, because I actually thought I was going to a halfway house, and because I had a place to go, they didn't even send me to a halfway house. But there are individuals who will need that, and so we need to understand, okay, what does exist for individuals who may have that particular need. And I think this goes to Saleem's point earlier. The DOC was very helpful when we came home because they had a place for people to go at, and the place understood the population that was coming out and made it like not that you wanted to be in still some level of carceral process, but they tried to, like, I think, make it less as burdensome for you. And this was 8th and Collar Hill. And so individuals were able to go there and they were able to come out pretty easy. Once you found a place to go, you were able to like transition to that. So it gave you the opportunity. And I will tell you, that's what some of the individuals say, that they might need that time to allow them to transition back to the community because things have changed a great deal. And so it allowed them to slowly transition back to the community. And so that's one of the things that I think we're going to be looking at, or just like as a collection, as a group, and just thinking about and looking, exploring what potential opportunities might exist. And I'll say, again, one thing I learned from doing this is that, it's not a cookie cutter approach. When Joe Legan came out, Joe Legan was 80 some years old. His reentry was completely different than many of the other individuals. And so we were able to, I think, identify the appropriate resources that was supported for Joe. And so we have to like look at all that because we know there are going to be a lot of individuals who are extremely old and can't get around, and that transition is going to look completely different. And so I'm looking forward to like just really convening with groups to explore that.
It's 1 o'clock, so I want to say thank you both so much for your participation in this and for so generously sharing your personal experience to answer some of these questions that folks have. It's certainly my hope that we can stay in these conversations as the landscape continues to evolve. The one thing that is very clear to me is that there is just a mountain of work to do here, politically, legally, in terms of reentry. So grateful to be in it with you all and to everybody in the audience for joining us. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for joining us too. Have a good day, everybody.
Yes, thank you all.